we are going to pivot into the next part of the agenda, which is the thermal and building sector presentations. And like Lena did earlier for the transportation sector, I'm just going to set a little bit of context from some of the key thermal takeaways and new material that we produced for the thermal sector in EAN's forthcoming annual progress report. So, the thermal sector, also known as the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector, is Vermont's highest energy using sector. You can see that in the blue circle that says 44%. As of 2021, the thermal sector was responsible for 31% of statewide greenhouse gas emissions, as reported in the latest Vermont greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the author of which, Colin Smythe, is here and does an incredible job. So the thermal sector was the second most climate polluting of all of our sectors, behind only transportation. And in terms of money spent on energy, the heating and cooling costs of Vermonters make up more than a third of the energy burden that Vermonters face when it comes to energy use. And you see that in the orange circle on the right. Of all of the energy sectors, the thermal sector has proven the most difficult to reduce emissions in. As of 2021, the thermal sector emissions have declined only by about 8% below 2005 levels, which is a key baseline in the Global Warming Solutions Act. In contrast, over that same time period, electricity emissions have declined 66%, and transportation emissions have declined by 25%. And you can see that in those columns there. That dashed black line is the reference line for the 2025, January 1st, 2025 Global Warming Solutions Act targets for each sector. In terms of energy use, the thermal sector in Vermont currently has four major fuel sources: fuel oil, fossil gas, propane, and wood, as you can see on the left. When it comes to emissions, more than half of them come from residential fuel use, a little over a third come from commercial fuel use, and 13% from industrial fuel use, as you can see from the pie chart on the right. To reduce Vermont's climate pollution from the thermal sector as much as possible, it is especially important to reduce fuel oil and propane use, which are the most heavily climate polluting heating fuels that are in widespread use in Vermont. You can see the relative carbon emissions factors, carbon intensities of the different fuels there. And the greatest opportunities to do so are in the residential and commercial sectors, where these fuels are most heavily used, which was shown in the previous slide. Reducing fuel oil and propane use, especially in the residential and commercial sectors, also presents the greatest opportunities to reduce energy cost burdens for Vermonters and Vermont businesses, as I'll discuss shortly. Regarding greenhouse gas emissions, it is important to note that historically, thermal sector emissions have moved in line, basically hand in hand, with the number of heating degree days in Vermont, or how warm or cold it is in a given year, and therefore how much heating demand there is. Over the past 3 decades, Vermont's winters have, on average, been getting warmer. While there is variation from year to year, as you can see from this chart, the clear trend is a warming one, with the average number of heating degree days in Vermont declining by about 4% over the period from 1990 to 2023, if you look at that trend line. The good news is that warmer winters are not the only reason for reduced fossil heating fuel use and therefore reduced climate pollution from the thermal sector. In recent years, thermal sector fuel use and emissions have begun to become decoupled. Now I want to look at energy burden and energy equity in the thermal sector. While energy consumption increases as income increases, as you can see in the blue bars on this graph, the share of income that is spent on energy, or the energy burden that Vermonters face, is much higher for Vermonters with lower incomes, as seen in orange bars. In particular, Vermonters who make less than 60% of area median income spend on average 19% of their income on heating and electricity. Fortunately, we weren't able to disaggregate those because of the data source we use for that, which is the American Community Survey. Part of the reason for high energy burdens facing Vermonters with lower and middle incomes is a disproportionate dependence on and use of the highest cost fuels, especially fuel oil and kerosene, which you can see represented at the very bottom of this graph in orange. So it goes left to right, lower incomes to higher incomes, and you see that at the lower income end of the spectrum, there's more dependence on fuel oil and kerosene. Let's look at this a little bit closer. Fuel oil, which is, I know there's a lot going on here. Hopefully you can see. Fuel oil is shown in purple, and kerosene is in pink, and propane is in gray. These are some of the highest cost ways to heat a home or a building, subjecting household and business budgets to major price volatility and unpredictability. In contrast, using heat pumps, which is shown in blue near the bottom, or wood heat, which is shown in green, allows Vermonters to use lower cost and more price-stable heating fuels, enabling significant savings, especially relative to fuel oil and propane. Before leaving the slide, I also want to note the difference in the yellow line at the top, and which represents resistance electric heat, such as baseboards and plug-in space heaters, and the blue line for electric heat pumps, which you see at the bottom. They use the same electricity, so why the massive difference in price that you see reflected on this graph? In a word, efficiency. We talked about this earlier in the transportation section. Rather than create heat from combustion or resistance, heat pumps transfer heat, allowing them to provide the same amount of heat with much less energy use. So you see the average efficiencies of different types of heat pumps over there on the right versus the combustion heating equipment on the left. The efficiency of heat pumps and the generally low cost, stable price of electricity allows for significant cost savings, especially in comparison to fuel oil or propane. Here's an example that we put together comparing the lifetime costs of equipment plus fuel use of using a propane water heater versus a heat pump water heater. Using the numbers from the state and EIA, on average, the propane water heater will cost you $9,500 over 12 years. In comparison, the heat pump water heater costs are anywhere from $3,000 to $7,000 less over that period, depending on what incentives are or are not utilized for the upfront purchase of the heat pump water heater. That's why you see that range between the green lines. And of course, heat pump water heaters create a tiny fraction of the climate pollution that a propane water heater does, as seen by comparing the small green dot to the very large orange circle. As Vermonters electrify, it's important to know that how and where we experience energy costs will shift. For instance, as we adopt EVs and heat pumps, our electric bills will go up. But because our fuel bills are also going down at the same time, the overall result can often be total savings, which this was a brainchild largely of CARS to be able to visualize this shift. And a number of these graphs that we're showing in these slides today, we've printed out and are around the room. Ben is pointing to this one in that corner. And if you have time, I encourage you to spend a little bit of time looking at these, and we'd love your feedback on them. But this is our attempt to help visualize that bill shift. Finally, it's important to note another major benefit of heat pumps, and that is their dual usability for both heating and cooling. As Vermont experiences more and more extreme heat days, this graph shows Burlington, for instance, which has seen an average of 140% increase in the number of extreme heat days annually over the past 60 years. The cooling ability of heat pumps will become increasingly important, not just for comfort, but also as a life-saving health and safety measure. We've seen in the past when there are multi-day heat waves in Vermont, often the folks who are ending up in emergency rooms or even dying in their homes are often older individuals who live alone and do not have any form of air conditioning, either from a unit or from a so that is our thermal overview.